Hallelujah. Welcome to the Miqra again. And Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
We are going to embark upon part 2 of a study we started last week. Last week we were looking at order in the body of Messiah, the biblical model for men at home and in assembly. And it's important that we started there, and that men are encouraged and spurred on, that is motivated, that the fire is lit under us men in order that we might do our part in being heads of homes and leaders in the assembly, so that order can be restored in the body of Messiah. Because with the liberal world view and all the liberalism and all the false ideas of how men and women are to conduct themselves among each other that the world brings forth, it gets really difficult and confusing. The world is confused, and even Christians and Messianics that are trying to serve the Almighty still receive those confusing and conflicting messages about how we are to conduct ourselves. And so it was important that I began with the men, because when the men do their part in being heads and leaders, then the women can do their parts. And we're going to talk about today, much easier. We're going to discuss not only the role of women, but the importance of women and the ministries that they can serve the body of Messiah in. So we're going to look at the biblical model for women at home and in assembly. And here's a few of our objectives today. Not to reinforce stereotypes, ancient stereotypes. I said ancient stereotypes because that's the way the ancient model is portrayed today. That those are just stereotypes based upon patriarchal society, and God never intended for His people to live in that kind of world, but that God created man and women equal, and equal in terms of service before the Almighty, and much of that is true. But we're going to try to sort out today what is true about that statement, that men and women are equal, but to sort out the distinctions that Father has established in the creation and that He's purposed for His people in terms of order and in terms of hierarchy, in terms of headship and subordination. So we're going to look at some of those things. Another objective is to present a purely biblical perspective on women. And so that's my goal, and that's what I'm going to try to do, as always, to present a biblical explanation for how the Father has designed these things. We looked at the Sabbath and the law and 100 other different topics, and we try to go back to the Bible, to the source, to the foundation of these teachings. Look at what the Torah, especially all the way back in the beginning at creation. We look at what the Torah says, what the prophets say, what the writings say, and then carry it further into the New Testament, what the Messiah taught on these things, and then what His apostles presented as truth, and the way to actually apply these things to the life of the church or assembly. Also to restore men and women to their purpose in Messiah so that the body may be healthy and grow. Another objective. And yet a fourth objective is to encourage women to find contentment in their roles. And again, when the men are doing their part, women will find contentment and satisfaction in the way that Father wants them to serve Him. So here's some of the topics. Those are the objectives. Here are some topics. Order in our homes, order in the assembly, that goes without saying, that was in the subtitle. Women are valued in the Bible and by Elohim. And we need to get that right. A teaching about submission is not about putting women down or putting them, quote unquote, in their place. It's about women taking on the proper giftings and exercising those gifts on behalf of the body. Submission along lines of authority, silence and submission. What does that mean? Silence and submission. We're all familiar with the passages where Paul talks about women being silent. We're going to look at those and try to really ascertain what that means. It doesn't mean that the women can't talk. That's not what it means. We are going to look at what it does mean. Role models from Scripture for women. There are a number of women that are given to us in Scripture, and they present to us a picture of how women ought to conduct themselves at home and in assembly, and exceptions from the norm in unusual circumstances. And usually those things from the other point of view that says women are equal in every circumstance in the body, these exceptions are cited. So we're going to look at the exceptions and why they were exceptions from the norm, from the biblical model for women. So let's talk about women being valued in the assembly. Women are people.
Amen.
Amen. Women are people.
Not animals.
Right. Yeah.
Hallelujah. Elohim made male and female in his image. And so, along those lines, men and women are equal because we're all made in his image. We're all in his likeness. We all take on the characteristics of Elohim and reflect his glory in some fashion. And so he's given male and female with their respective roles and responsibilities to reflect his image. And so let's remember that women are people and are valued in Elohim's sight, and they need to be valued in our sight, in our assembly. However, the rabbis devalued women. The rabbis devalued women. And this is where a big problem comes, and why there's such a great emphasis in the New Testament from Paul about the seeming conflict between Paul elevating women and Paul seems also in certain places to be saying that women need to take a subordinate place. Okay, so there's conflict and misinterpretation in those things. He does both. He elevates and he tries to set and reestablish a pattern that was established by Elohim in creation. And so because the rabbis devalued women, and it can be seen in the fact that the rabbis wouldn't even talk to women. They wouldn't even talk to women because they considered them inferior in some fashion. And so they set a standard in Israel, the way that the religion in Israel was practiced, by devaluing women, but that was not the Father's plan. And so another reason to be very skeptical of rabbinical teaching. We've seen it in a lot of other areas where the rabbis inflated certain things and deflated other things. They added to Torah, they subtracted from Torah, they devalue women. The Master, Messiah, included women in his following, his traveling companions. A rabbi in Israel would not do that. A rabbi would not have women sitting down in front of him and teaching them Torah. They taught only men. But the Master elevated and valued women. He included them in his entourage. And some of these places where the Messiah shows that he is elevating women to their proper place, to their proper position of honor and esteem, and a place where they have input and value in the body. I'll quote a couple of them. This is one of them. In Matthew 12:50, he says, "Whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." A rabbi would never have said such a thing. But Messiah said it because those who do the will our family, their brother, sister, mother. And so he elevated women here. And Paul in Galatians 3:28 made this statement, there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, you are all one in Messiah. And some people would say, well, that this means that male and female are equal in every respect. And yet that's not the impact of what Paul is saying. He's alluding to the fact that that Elohim made male and female in his image, and that we all have great value in the Father's sight. Another slide, women are people. Remember, women are people, hallelujah.
Amen.
The crippled woman, he called a daughter of Abraham. This is something a rabbi would never say. The rabbis always referred to the sons of Abraham. Okay, and it was the men who were exalted by the rabbis and lifted up. Even though Father did place men as head, okay, and leaders in the assembly. And we saw that last week in our study. But women were also daughters of the patriarchs. And so that there was a certain esteem, a certain status in being a daughter of Abraham, just like the boys were sons of Abraham. The Samaritan woman, the rabbis would have never stopped to talk to the Samaritan woman, but the Messiah talked to her and explained to her who he was. And in fact, what the Samaritan woman did, or what Messiah did on behalf of the Samaritan woman, was to tell her, just like he told Peter, that he was the Messiah. She was the first one that Messiah revealed his status of the anointed one coming. It was to this Samaritan woman. He infers upon her intelligence, because he was explaining about the difference between the two places where the Jews and the Samaritans were worshiping, and he explained again that he was the Messiah. The Canaanite woman was a woman of value in the Messiah's sight. She came to him and expected a healing, and came to him and sat at his, was begging at his feet. And the disciples were saying, let her go, push her away. But she talked to the Canaanite woman. And when she said, the children, the bread is for the children, but even the dogs come and eat the crumbs from the master's table, the Messiah said, this woman has great faith. Okay, so he valued her input and her intellect and her seeking after the Messiah. Mary at the home of Simon. It says that he healed, Mary at the home of Simon. In Luke chapter 7, she was called a sinner. Simon didn't even want her in his home. He said, Master, why are you talking? Why are you letting this woman touch you? And the Messiah didn't feel that way about her, though she was a sinner. He reached out to her and allowed her to touch him and to receive forgiveness of sins and healing. Women in the parable, the woman mixing leaven into flour. He included women in his teaching. The woman searching for a lost coin. And so the Messiah always included, these are all things that the rabbis wouldn't do, but the Messiah stepped out and would not be confined by those cultural and by those religious norms of the day. And he reached out and was restoring women to their proper place of being valued in the Father's sight. Then there was, of course, the poor widow as well, who gave all that she had. And she was an example to the men of how to give yourself wholly to the Father. She gave all that she had. Mary sitting at his feet. Luke 10, I think I already covered that. Martha's confession. Again, like Peter's. Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus. It says that Mary sat at, this is a different Mary. Sorry, Mary was sitting at his feet, and receiving the word. And Martha complained about Mary, and he said, no, I'm not going to take that away from Mary. She's chosen the better thing, to be at my feet and to listen as a disciple. Martha's confession, when Messiah explained to her that he was the resurrection and the life, Martha confessed that he was the Messiah. Peter's mother-in-law ministered to them in Matthew chapter 8. A band of women ministered to Messiah in Luke chapter 8. Women at the crucifixion and at the resurrection ministered to the Messiah and were there every step of the way in Messiah's ministry. And so the Messiah valued women, and we need to do the same. And we do need to understand that the things that are said, the patterns that were established, were not meant to diminish women, but to allow a certain order so that the body of Messiah can be served in a way that brings glory to the Father. It's also a reflection of the Father that men are the leaders in the home and heads, just as Messiah. We read in Ephesians, just as Messiah is the head of the man, men are the head of the women. And so, though women are valued, here's the but. Here's the but. And it's not, maybe but's not the right word. In order to make these distinctions in the roles that men and women serve, the Master did not select women to be apostles. And this is important because it tells something about what the Master taught. And we don't have everything that the Master taught. Someone said that if all of the things were written, all the books in the world wouldn't be able to contain all of the information. And so we're only given little glimpses of what the Master taught along the way. The Master taught women, and we're going to see a statement by Paul in a few minutes about how this is what the Master taught. The women were not selected to be apostles. They were not selected to be heads and leaders in Israel. And we looked at that whole scenario last week in our study of men, where the patriarchs and the genealogies and the priests, especially the priests, that was a really important one, and the judges that were selected, they were all men. They were all selected to be the leaders and rulers in Israel as heads of their homes and as heads in the congregation. So why didn't the Master select women to be apostles? Was it a cultural thing, or were there biblical reasons for that? And I'm going to suggest that what we just looked at in terms of the women being exalted and included in the teachings and in the ministry of the Messiah, that he was not persuaded by cultural arguments and by the traditions of the elders and rabbis in terms of what he was teaching, because he came to teach the pure Torah and the prophets. He wasn't there to preach man-made traditions. And he made a really big deal about that, and it comes out in a variety of different ways. And so it wasn't a cultural consideration that the Master did not select women. See, that doesn't make any sense in the Scriptures. The biblical reasons, however, are compelling, and we looked at those reasons again last week when we looked at the men being selected for leadership roles. Surely the Master was moved by his Father's design of men and women as the reason he did not elevate women into leadership roles, and particularly in this case, to be apostles sent out by him. So we're going to look at some of these biblical reasons for women taking on the role that they take on, and what those roles are in the authority structure that the Almighty established in the beginning. And it begins with, we're going to read some of these Pauline scriptures, because this is where all the controversy takes place. No one would argue about the Messiah elevating women in his ministry. There were many women that he did elevate, and he made it very clear that women were important to him. So let's look at the controversial statements of Paul and try to sort these out and make sense of them in a biblical sense and not in a cultural sense. First, I'm going to read Ephesians. And this is kind of a review of something we studied about 6 months ago when we were doing the book of Ephesians. But I'm going to read it again anyway, just for review's sake, and then to make a few points here. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 21 through the end of the chapter, verse 33. It says, verse 20, giving thanks always for all to Elohim the Father in the name of our Master, Yahushua Messiah, subjecting yourselves to each other in the fear of Elohim. Wives, subject yourselves to your own husbands as to the Master, because the husband is the head of the wife, as also the Messiah is the head of the assembly, and he is Savior of the body. But as the assembly is subject to Messiah, so also let the wives be to their own husbands in every respect. Husbands, love your wives, as Messiah also did love the assembly and gave himself for it, in order to set it apart and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word, in order to present it to himself a splendid assembly, not having spot or wrinkle or of any of this sort, but that it might be set apart and blameless. In this way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his body, he who loves his wife, loves himself. No one ever hated his own flesh, but feeds and cherishes it, as also the Master does the assembly, because we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this cause a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This secret, this mystery is great, but I speak concerning Messiah and the assembly. However, you too, everyone, let each one love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she fears her husband. So, verse 21 begins with, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And this is the NIV rendering. The King James says, submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of God. I'm not sure why the difference between God and Christ in these verses. I think the King James Version was based on the manuscripts available, 500 years ago, whereas we have a lot more manuscripts, and evidently the biblical scholars feel like the evidence, the overwhelming evidence of manuscript evidence is that Christ or Messiah was the word that was there in verse 21. But anyway, the main point is it to submit to one another or to submit one to another? And there's a difference between those two things. Are we talking about mutual submission of one to another, or are we talking about submission along a certain line of authority, one to another, meaning this one submitting to that one? The Greek word is hupotasso. It means to arrange under, to subordinate, to subject, to put in subjection, to obey, to be under the authority of, to take a subordinate place. Subordination is not a bad word. It's not a bad thing. It just means that somebody has to be the leader and somebody has to be the one following the leader. Okay? And so hupotasso does have all of these meanings, but the idea here is that one is the head and the other one is the follower. The Greek word alelois is translated either one another or one to another, reciprocally or mutually. If that's the way we're interpreting Paul's message here, we would interpret it reciprocally. In other words, to one another. In other words, everyone submits to everyone else in some sort of manner. Whereas if Paul's really laying down a certain authority structure, we would say it's not a reciprocal or not a mutual submission, but it's, again, a submission along a certain line. And so that would be the proper way. to interpret that. That is the second way. It's not a mutual submission that Paul's talking about. And I'll explain why in just a moment. But here are a couple of the translations. Again, the NIV, submit to one another, that's reciprocal or mutual. Submit one to another, that is not reciprocal, but along a certain line. And so that would be the better translation. And so here's the logic of the text, and here's why I think it's very clear that Paul is saying this, that we don't submit everyone to everyone else, but along these authority lines. He says in verse 21, submit to one another out of reverence for Messiah. And then in the section about wives, he says, wives, to your husbands. So it's wives that are to submit to their husbands because, he explains, the husband is the head of the wife. Children, obey your parents. Children are to submit to their parents. And slaves, obey your earthly masters. Slaves are supposed to submit to and obey their earthly masters. It wouldn't make sense the other way around, that masters would submit to slaves, or that children, or that parents would submit to children. It never works very well that way. When the parents are submitting to the children, it cannot be that way, and it would be absurd to think so. So, covering these full verses that describe these three areas of submission. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Messiah is the head of the assembly, his body, of which he's the Savior. Now, as the assembly submits to Messiah, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. And again, this is in line with and agrees with what the Torah teaches in terms of heads of homes, of heads in Israel, and all of the things we read about in the Torah where the men are the heads and the leaders of the tribes of Israel. Children, obey your parents in Yahweh, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. And so he cites this fifth commandment of the 10 words as evidence that children should submit to their parents. Honor your father and mother is the commandment, and it comes with a promise. It wouldn't make any other sense, any other way. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Messiah. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but like slaves of Messiah, excuse me, doing the will of Elohim from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly as if you are serving Yahuwah. So again, to review this point, why not reciprocal or mutual submission? When Paul tells us to submit one to another, what he really has in mind is that we should submit to one another along the lines of authority structures implemented by Elohim. Each of the social tiers have their own roles and responsibilities. And everyone answers or is responsible to someone above them. Slaves are accountable to their masters. Children are accountable to their parents. Wives are answerable to their husbands. And their husbands take responsibility, as we saw last week, particularly in the case of a man being able to override a vow or an oath taken by an unmarried woman in his home or his wife. And so wives are answerable, and the men, the husbands, are responsible. Even men are responsible for those under their authority and are accountable to Messiah. So men are also accountable. Men are accountable to the Messiah. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11:3, I want you to realize that the head of every man is Messiah, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Messiah is Elohim. Everyone is under the authority of someone and is responsible and answerable to that authority. So at the end of the day, Paul most emphatically does not teach mutual submission in the body of Messiah. Such a scenario would be absurd. If this were true, parents would have to submit to their children, masters to their slaves, And it is only if these two conditions are true, if parents have to submit to children and slaves, and masters to slaves, then it would be true that husbands should also be submitting to their own wives. Each of these is emphatically and explicitly excluded by the teaching of Paul in this passage. I hope that's clear. And so now we're going to look at the reasons why Paul makes these kind of bold and brash and strong statements about this authority structure and headship and submission. Why should women be submissive? Altogether, in two places in the scriptures, in 1 Corinthians and in 1 Timothy, Paul rehearses 6 distinct reasons why women should walk in submission and exercise silence. And we're going to look at silence in a few minutes. Don't let that term scare you away or make you angry. We'll look at that, what that means. When in congregation, and why women should have no authority over a man. First of all, the first reason he gives is that Adam was formed first and then Hava, or Eve. Secondly, we're going to break these down in a moment. Secondly, the woman was deceived and became a sinner. Third, there is no other practice in all the congregations of the saints but for women to remain silent. And that's really important because if this were a teaching that was just for a certain and particular situation in Corinth, where women were out of control and hollering out in the assembly, then he would not have indicated that all the congregations do it this way. That this isn't a cultural or a temporary established rule for any one particular assembly, but that all the assemblies were practicing this thing where women were in submission in the assembly. Number 4, the Torah says that women should be submissive and silent. Well, where does the Torah say that? And we're going to try to break that out as well. Paul says this: it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the assembly. And then finally, he said what Paul is saying about the role of women is a command from the master. It's a command from the master. We don't know exactly what the master said, but evidently the saints knew what the master said. Not everything was written down, but the saints knew what the apostles and those who were with the Messiah were teaching, that the master taught. And so Paul's appeal to the fact that this is a command from the master could have been received because the people understood this to be the master's command. So over to 1 Timothy chapter 2. Paul instructs Timothy about men and women. In 1 Timothy 2, where he says, I want men everywhere to lift up holy hands in prayer without anger or disputing. So again, this is one of the roles, not exclusive to men. Women could lift up hands in prayer, pray as well, but men were encouraged, and Paul was encouraging Timothy to teach the men to lift up holy hands in prayer. And so we men need to be more involved in praying for the saints and lifting up holy hands. I also want women to dress modestly with decency and propriety, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds, appropriate for women who profess to worship Elohim. And so here Paul makes the point that not that it's wrong for women to dress up and to look beautiful and to dress modestly, even with gold or pearls. That wasn't his point. Not to say that women shouldn't do that, but that shouldn't be the focus of the woman's attention and why women should be commended. We're going to look at some role models of women who were beautiful women, but they weren't commended for their outward adornment or their beauty. They were commended for the heart of submission and yielding to their husbands and to the assembly. This is what is revealed in the Torah and in the New Testament. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. And this is really what this whole thing about being silent. It's about quietness. It's about not being interrupting. And so that point of view where people are saying the women were up in the balcony hollering down from the balcony and interrupting, I'm sure that happened. That probably happened on occasion. But that's not what Paul's talking about when he's talking about learning in quietness and full submission. He's saying that women should take this stance in the congregation to be submissive to their husbands and not to presume that they should be having leadership roles. Let me just leave it there right now, and we'll get to that more later. 4, number 1, Adam was formed first. Oh, well, let me go back. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be silent. And so any woman is not, in Paul's point of view, supposed to teach or have authority. And that's because man has authority over his wife. That's where the authority structure was established, for the woman to be under the authority of her husband. And so the first reason for that was Adam was formed first and then Chava. And then secondly, Adam was not the one deceived, it was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. So somebody brought up the point, I think it might have even been last week, that the woman was deceived, but the man entered into sin willingly and knowingly. And so isn't the man's sin greater than the woman's sin? Maybe so. Maybe the man, his sin was more grievous and egregious. But Chava was deceived, and this is the point of failure. This is where mankind entered into sin. It was because Chava was deceived and first fell into sin. And so, for whatever reason, there's this order that Paul seems to be teaching from, the order of being formed. Man was formed first, then Chava. The woman was deceived first, and then the man. And for those two reasons, the woman should submit to the man, because the woman is basically under the headship of the man. Hesukia, there's two words in the Greek text that are translated silence, or something along that line, quietness. Here the word quietness is hesukia. That means the state of quietness without disturbance, quietness, rest. State of saying nothing or very little, silence. There's another word that we'll look at that means almost the same thing. And Paul uses that in another place. But they're really synonyms, this hesukia and the other word, sigao, I believe it is. It means to be silent. So the order is the first argument Paul uses in these two cases. Adam was formed first. The woman was deceived and sinned first. So going back to the fact that Adam was formed first, we're going to look at this idea of the woman being created as man's helper. And we're going to read a couple verses on this. It says, Yahweh Elohim said, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him." So the man was formed out of the ground first. And Elohim breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. But at that point in time, there was not a separate woman that he created at the same time. The woman was not yet formed out of his side. Right now there was just the male, the man. Now Yahweh Elohim had formed out of the ground all the beasts of the field and all the birds of the air. He brought them to the man to see what he would name them, and whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. And so the man gave names to all the livestock, the birds of the air, and the beasts of the field, but for Adam no suitable helper was found. So man, before the woman was taken from his side, named all of the creatures. The thrust of the passage is in the phrase, helper suitable for him. And this is it's a good translation of the Hebrew words that occur there. Ezer kenegdo. Ezer is a word that means to help or to support. Neged, which is where this word kenegdo comes from, neged, comes from the root word to be conspicuous or to declare, to tell. This is a real common word in Hebrew, to make known. And thus neged usually indicates something in front of, or in the face of, or before or opposite to. And thus helper before him is the idea of what this helper was to be for. This helper was to be in the face of Adam. In other words, it was that corresponding person, the person that was his complement. As I think I stated in this next slide or two. Each of the animals that Adam named had a mate, a complementary, like creature, with whom each of the animals could reproduce its own kind. But Adam didn't have one of those, and thus the helper suitable for him, or the Ezer kenegdo, the helper in his face, was clearly a reference primarily to the mating partner, or the complement to Adam, in order to do for Adam what Adam couldn't do for himself. As a male, he couldn't reproduce his kind as a male by himself. And thus, Ezer kenegdo is a helper who stands in front of as a mate or partner, his completing part. So as a mating partner, this helper is not Adam's equal. Again, I re-emphasize that. The woman is not his equal in this sense. The male and female are equal in Elohim's sight because they're made in his image, but there are differences that are very important. And so this helper is not Adam's equal. He did not need an equal. He needed someone to do for him what he could not do for himself. He needed a mating partner. He needed somebody to complete the gaps in him. The helper is not Adam's competition. The helper is designed to fill in where Adam needed filling in. The completing partner, the mate, can accomplish for Adam what Adam couldn't accomplish alone. Okay? So that's what the Ezer kenegdo is all about, the helpmeet. I think the King James says it that way, the helpmeet, or the partner that is the complement to the man. Paul gives further instructions in 1 Corinthians 14 about women and why they shouldn't have authority over a man. The third reason he gave is because this is the practice in all the congregation of the saints, that the women should be silent in the assemblies. So again, it wasn't just a local problem that was occurring that Paul was addressing. It was a universal practice that women remain silent, and it was a practice in Old Testament times. It was the practice in New Testament times. And all of the apostles were on board with this way, and this teaching about men and women in their roles within the assembly. We're going to look at what Peter says, because it's a full complement to what Paul teaches about men and women in the assembly. The fourth reason is because the Torah says so. And here's that other word that, sigao again, to be silent, to remain silent, to keep silent. And that's the word used here in verse 33, that women should remain silent in the assemblies. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home. Number 5, it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the assembly. This word disgraceful is a really strong term that Paul uses. It's a term especially significant in honor-shame-oriented society, generally in reference to that which fails to meet expected moral and cultural standards, pertaining to being socially or morally unacceptable, shameful, base, or even obscene. It would be obscene. That's a really strong term for a woman to speak out in the assembly, according to Paul. Again, why is that? And we're looking into those reasons from the Torah and the prophets. Did the word of Elohim originate with you? See, the appeal, again, is to the word of Elohim Paul is making in regard to it being disgraceful for women to speak in the assembly. It's from the source of this is the word of Elohim. Are you the only people it has reached? If anybody thinks he is a prophet or spiritually gifted, let him acknowledge that what I am writing to you is the master's command. If he ignores this, he himself will be ignored. And so not only does the Torah teach this, but the master taught it as well. And sometimes it's not altogether clear where the Torah teaches this and where the master teaches it. But that's Paul's appeal to the saints, is that this is the universal teaching that has its source in the word of Elohim, and the Messiah himself taught it and re-emphasized it in his teachings to his disciples. Some say that Paul's antiquated teaching about silence and submission was only for the situation in Corinth. Again, a bit of good advice, but not law for the church or for the assembly. But Paul taught Titus and Timothy to teach this same message. And so this was universally taught. And we're going to look at Peter as well. Peter did the same. But first, Paul taught Titus and Timothy that this was the teaching for the assemblies. And here's where it is in Titus. Paul writes to elder Titus, he says, likewise, in Titus chapter 2, verses 3 through 5, teach the older women to be reverent in the way they live, not to be slanderers or addicted to much wine, but to teach what is good. Then they can train the younger women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled and pure, to be busy at home, to be kind, and to be subject to their husbands, so that no one will malign the word of Elohim. And so this was the model that Paul was teaching Titus regarding women, is that the older women have certain responsibilities to train the younger women and their children. Well, it says to train the younger women to love their husbands and children. And then these personal qualities of self-control and purity. To be busy at home. In other words, the home was the central focus of the woman, to exercise her gifts with her husband and to her children, and to be subject to their own husbands in their own homes, so that the word of Elohim wouldn't be maligned. Again, of the appeal to the word of Elohim. The word of Elohim teaching this principle throughout would have been maligned if the women were allowed to break outside of those norms, those biblical norms, and to go outside of those boundaries, and to be teachers and have authority over men in the congregation. Paul says to Timothy the same thing. I also want women to dress modestly, with decency and propriety, not with braided hair of gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds, appropriate for women who profess to worship Elohim. So these are the norms for women. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach her to have authority over man. She must be silent. We already read that. For Adam was formed first, and then Chava. Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. And propriety means that they're in agreement with these established norms or patterns at home and in the assembly. Propriety means having everything in its proper place. And so women are encouraged to have established in their own homes and in the assembly this order that they acknowledge is from the word of Elohim, that the Messiah taught, and that they should go along with it, that they should be in agreement with these established norms. The argument that Paul was making to the particular situation in Corinth, or that he was teaching a custom but not law, is refuted again, not only by his instruction, by Paul's instruction to Titus and Timothy, but when we realize that Peter taught the same thing about the role of women in the assembly. Peter also teaches that women should have a gentle and quiet spirit and be subject to their husbands. These are the same words that Paul uses, that we get all upset with Paul and think that he is a chauvinist and that he's only teaching cultural things of the day or customs of the times, and not realizing that what Paul is teaching is from the Word. Here's what Peter says, 1 Kepha chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Again, the same things. He appeals to submission to the husbands. He appeals to the outward adornment as not being the main focus of the woman, but a gentle and quiet spirit. Exactly the way that Paul described it, and using the exact same Greek words, the words that are translated silent and submission. Here's what Peter writes. Wives, in the same way, be submissive to your husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives. When they see the purity and reverence of your lives. That's where the real beauty comes from, the purity and reverence of your lives. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as braided hair, the wearing of gold jewelry, and fine clothes. Instead, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in Elohim's sight. For this is the way the holy women of the past, who put their hope in Elohim, used to make themselves beautiful. They were submissive to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her master. You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. And so this appeal to Sarah, Sarah's kind of like the mother of Israel, if you will. If Abraham was the father, then Sarah was the mother of Israel, and Sarah is the role model. And so Peter appeals to Sarah as a role model for women. The instruction to be quiet or silent is about having a spirit and attitude of submission. It doesn't mean shut up, okay? It's not like that. It's not saying that women cannot speak, but instead what it's emphasizing is the submissive spirit of the woman. Because there are many roles that women can play, and we're going to look at those toward the end of the teaching. The women speak in the congregation and have a part in the ministry of the congregation. But in this attitude of submission is where Paul is emphasizing women should be silent. It is not intended to hold women back or to put them in their place, but to show respect for Elohim and the authority structure which Yahweh established for his people. Yahweh intended that men take the leadership role at home and in assembly. And with that comes the responsibility of it. So women are instructed to respect that order and to give men their place of leadership without interfering. And, in our day, women have a much greater role in speaking and teaching and all of those things. But it's primarily because the men have dropped the ball. And so I have tried to encourage the men to pick it up again and to run with it and to take on their responsibilities at home and in the assembly so that women can then fall back into their supportive roles in the assembly and do their part as Elohim has established it and ordered it. Women's role models from the Torah. And Sarah, of course, was the first one. Peter mentioned her. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 11, it says, Avram said to his wife Sarah, I know that you are, what a beautiful woman you are. And so that contrast that both Paul and Peter make between the outward adornment and the inner beauty is fashioned after the role models of the women that are going to be cited. A couple of them are pointed out to have been beautiful women Sarah was the first one. Abram said, I know what a beautiful woman you are. And when Abram came to Mitzrayim, the Mitzrayim saw that she was a very beautiful woman. Sarah was beautiful, but this is not what she's commended for. Men were selected for leadership roles, patriarchs, priests, genealogies, and so forth. And women's role models were the great women of the scriptures are portrayed throughout the Old Testament and then again in the New as submitting to their men and with a servant's heart. Back to Sarah, the submissive woman. Yahweh said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. And now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already old and well advanced in years, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. And Sarah laughed to herself, and she thought, and evidently she didn't just thought, but this was expressed, or it wouldn't have been written. She thought, after I am worn out and my master is old, will I now have this pleasure? She must have shared this testimony, but the fact that she was even thinking in these terms and expressed them by her lifestyle, that her husband was her master. Okay, she acknowledged that her husband was the head of the household by calling him master, and that was Peter's point when he referred to Sarah as a role model. So she referred to her husband as master. In the same account of Yahweh and the two messengers appearing to Abraham, we can see another demonstration of Sarah's submissive spirit. As the three visitors arrived to talk with Abraham, he requested of Sarah to prepare food for the strangers. She did not whine or complain that her husband tasked her with the preparation of food. Rather, she quickly complied with his directives and fulfilled his request. So she did have a submissive and obedient spirit to her husband. And that's a role model for women. She, again, was the mother of Israel. And so Abraham and Sarah are role models for all of us, for the men and the women of our congregations. Rivka, or Rebecca, Rivka is the Hebrew name in Genesis chapter 24. This is when Abraham's servant went searching out for a wife for Yitzhak, or Isaac, Abraham's son. It says he prayed, Yahweh Elohim of my master Abraham, give me success today and show kindness to my master Abraham. Look, I am standing beside this spring, and the daughters of the townspeople are coming out to draw water. May it be that when I say to a girl, please let down your jar that I may have a drink, and she says, drink and I'll water your camels too. Let her be the one you have chosen for your servant Yitzhak. And by this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master. So no sooner had he prayed this prayer that Rivka appeared with her jar on her shoulder. And this is what the text says about Rivka, Rebecca. The girl was very beautiful. A virgin, no man had ever lain with her. But her physical beauty, again, is not what is striking about her in this account of Rivka. It was her actions that were stunning. The servant hurried to meet her and said, please give me a little water from your jar. Drink, my master, she said, and quickly lowered the jar to her hands and gave him a drink. And after she had given him a drink, she said, I'll draw water for your camels too until they have finished drinking. And so she quickly emptied her jar into the trough, ran back to the well to draw more water, and drew enough for all his camels. This was a stranger. She didn't even know this man. And yet she was working on his behalf and serving him with a servant's heart. And this showed the servant of Abraham that her heart was one of submission and service. She was a godly woman. And so by that, Elohim showed the servant that this was the woman that he had chosen for Yitzhak. Another role model from the Torah is Deborah, or Deborah. It says in Judges chapter 4, verses 4 and 5, that Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidot, was judging Israel at that time. So it's interesting that Deborah was both a prophetess and a judge. And this seems to step outside of the normal range of roles and responsibilities for women. But we're going to see in a minute why this happened. It says she held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the sons of Israel came to her to have their disputes decided. Even though we saw that, as with the case of Yitro, Moses' father-in-law, he instructed Moses to appoint judges, and so all of the judges were selected from among the men, and that was the normal pattern. But here Deborah is a prophetess and a judge. Note also that she's identified as the wife of Lapidot. In other words, the authority that she's under is indicated here. She wasn't working completely independent of her husband, but it's recognized that she was the wife of Lapidot. In other words, giving, at least identifying the headship of Deborah in her home. So why was Deborah appointed a prophetess and a judge in Israel? And the account seems to indicate very clearly the reasons for that. It says, she sent for Barak, son of Binoam, from Kedesh in Naphtali, and said to him, Yahweh, the Elohim of Israel, commands you, go, take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead the way to Mount Tabor. I will lure Sisera, the commander of Yabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River, and give him into your hands. And so she delivered this word to Barak. And then here's Barak's response. Barak said to her, if you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go. It sounds like a man who's not taking on manliness or the responsibility of what men were supposed to do in Israel. He was depending upon a woman to lead the way. He didn't want to lead, and this is the reason Deborah was chosen, or at least it's the implied reason. It doesn't come out and say that explicitly, but I think the account makes it very clear that Deborah was leading because Barak, who was supposed to be the leader in Israel, wouldn't lead without taking her lead. If you go with me, I'll go, but if you don't go with me, I won't go. And I hope that's not how our men are going to conduct themselves in the assembly. We need to step up and do the things that Father has appointed us so that the women don't have to take on roles that they may not be comfortable filling, but they're willing to, because the women are willing to serve Yahweh in whatever way He calls them. So because of the way you're going about this, she said to him, the honor will not be yours, for Yahweh will hand Sisera over to a woman. And so Deborah went from Barak to Kadesh, where he summoned Zebulun and Naphtali. Deborah had to do this, even though she instructed that the father was telling Barak to do this. Deborah had to do it. 10,000 men followed him, and Deborah also went with him. And sometimes when women are called into leadership positions, especially when there are no men brave enough to man up. Men, this is a call to action from the scriptures. So it seems that Deborah had to lead Israel in their defeat of the enemy on the battlefield because the men lacked the courage to do so on their own. Deborah was an exceptional woman.
Yeah.
Her role as judge over Israel was unusual and unprecedented. She was privileged to excel outside the box of normal, acceptable expectations for women. She was an exception, but she did the work. And that's okay when women do the work if men aren't doing the work they're supposed to be doing. Her role and responsibility was not from Elohim's normal, established authority structure, but Elohim will always find a willing party to do His will, even if those chosen for the task balk at His bidding. And so there are exceptions of women taking leadership roles in Israel. But it's not the norm. It's not what Elohim desires in the pattern authority He has established. Let's take a look at another woman, Ruth. And her as a role model is demonstrated in this text where it says, Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the girls. I have told the men not to touch you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. This was her submissive spirit to Boaz. And this was at the heart of Ruth, and why she was selected to be the ancestor, or to be the actual predecessor of David the king. "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" she said. And Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. How you left your father and mother in your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May Yahweh repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by Yahweh, the Elohim of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." And she said, "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my master. You have given me comfort and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls." And so Ruth's humility and submission to Boaz, even again calling him her master, and she Boaz's servant. And this is what is commended and what's noticed about Ruth. Abigail, yet another beautiful woman, commended for her servant's attitude. There was this is during David's time, a certain man in Maon who had property there at Carmel, was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was sharing in Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail, or Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman. Here again, yet another woman that was recognized as intelligent and beautiful. But her husband, Calebite, was surly and mean in his dealings. And so you may remember the story that David and his men were abiding in the area at the time and were watching over Nabal's sheep and protecting them from marauders. And there came a point in time where David needed food for himself and his men. And he went to Nabal and pointing out the fact that he had been protecting Nabal's sheep and his monetary or financial interest, namely his sheep. And so it says that Nabal rejected his offers and refused to help David and his men. And David was arming up to go and to strike down Nabal out of anger, which would have been a mistake. But it says when David approached and when Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey and bowed down before David with her face to the ground, an act of submission to David. She fell at his feet and said, "My master," there it is again, "my master, let the blame be on me alone. Please let your servant speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. May my master pay no attention to that wicked man Nabal. He is just like his name. His name is fool," and that's what Nabal means in Hebrew, fool. "He's a fool just like his name, and folly goes with him. But as for me, your servant, I did not see the men my master sent." And so then David sent word to Abigail, asking her to become his wife. And this was after Nabal fell dead. And so Abigail was available. And David saw the beauty of this woman with a quiet and submissive spirit and asked her to become his wife. His servants went to Carmel and said to Abigail, "David has sent us to you to take you to become his wife." And she bowed down with her face to the ground again and said, "Here is your maidservant, ready to serve you and wash the feet of my master's servants." So again, another great woman in Israel is shown to be having a servant's heart and an attitude of submission. So when Paul talks about the Torah teaching this is what he's alluding to, both the role of the men in the society, but also the role model of the women, and it's all pointing to the fact that this is the way, these were the roles that men and women were to play in Israel, the things that Elohim had established. Anna in the New Testament was a prophetess, the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher. Again, she's identified by her father. It says she was very old and she'd lived with her husband 7 years after her marriage, and then was a widow until she was 84. She never left the temple but worshiped night and day, fasting and praying. Coming up to them at that very moment, she gave thanks to Elohim and spoke about the child to all who were looking forward to the redemption in Jerusalem. And so this is the account where Joseph and Mary, the mother of our Messiah, came to the temple. And so Anna met them and prophesied. And so she was a prophetess, but she's identified by her father, which is also important. In other words, there's still an authority that she was under, even though she was a prophetess in Israel. Priscilla, another disciple of the Master, she was a disciple and facilitator. It says in 1 Corinthians 16:9, the assemblies in the province of Asia send you greetings. Aquila and Priscilla greet you warmly in Yahweh, and so does the assembly that meets at their house. Now, Priscilla is used as an example of somebody that was maybe an apostle or maybe an elder or whatever, but it never really says that about Priscilla. The only thing it says about Priscilla is that her and her husband had an assembly that met in their home. So she was a facilitator and hospitable and was exercising her gifts and a disciple, but it really never says, even though it commends Paul by mentioning her here in his letter, it is drawing attention to her. It doesn't say that Paul was indicating that she was a ruler or a head in the assembly of Messiah. Lydia was another person mentioned in Acts chapter 16. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth from the city of Thyatira, who was a worshiper of Elohim. Yahweh opened her heart to respond to Paul's message, and when she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. If you consider me a believer in Yahweh, she said, come and stay at my house. And she persuaded us. So Lydia was mentioned because of her status as prayer warrior. They met her at the river where people were praying, and also because of her hospitality, and that she was exercising some form of ministry in terms of bringing the disciples to her home and ministering to them there. Other notable women, Phoebe was mentioned in Romans chapter 16 as the helper of many, and this is where the idea of the deacons or servants, where people think that maybe some of these women were anointed deacons in the assembly, but it never really says that. As we talked about last week, deacon can mean in a general sense, a servant, or deacon can refer to an anointed position within the assembly. In the book of Acts, the anointed positions were given to the 7 men who were chosen, but there were no women selected to be anointed deacons. However, women could be deacons, servants. Phoebe was one of those. Mary, Tryphosa worked hard in the Lord. Euodia in Philippians chapter 4, and Syntyche labored side by side with me, Paul says. And so Paul's mentioning these women that were involved in ministry and at his side performing tasks and ministry on behalf and alongside of Paul, on behalf of the assemblies of Messiah. And so nowhere do we really see a clear example that was a norm where a woman was selected to be an apostle or a shepherd or a pastor teacher in the assemblies of Messiah. But just about every other role of ministry could be filled by women, and were filled by women. And women were commended for their supportive roles in the body of Messiah. We can't really leave out the passage of the virtuous woman and think that we have really covered the role model for women in the Torah, prophets, and writings, because Proverbs chapter 31 lays out a couple of important things about women and how they serve at home and in the assembly. It says, a wife of noble character who can find, she is worth far more than rubies. In verses 11 and 12, it speaks of her husband, and in verse 23, her husband has full confidence in her and lacks nothing of value. She brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. Again, suggesting her role as being submissive to her husband. Her husband is respected at the city gate, where he takes his seat among the elders of the land. But it doesn't say that the woman takes her seat with the elders of the land. And that's, again, another important distinction. About her specifically, it says this: she selects wool and flax and works with eager hands. She's like the merchant ships, bringing her food from afar. She gets up while it is still dark. She provides food for her family and portions for her servant girls. She considers a field and buys it. Out of her earnings she plants a vineyard. She sets about her work vigorously. Her arms are strong for her tasks. So here is indicated that a woman works in the home, but also outside the home. She has a lucrative business, as it were, of selling her wares, her goods, the things she makes, and making a profit, making money on behalf of the family. And so it says with her, out of her earnings, she plants a vineyard. So she's busy working in and out of the home. And that's a role model for women. This old stereotype that women should only stay at home is just simply not biblical. Women can work inside and outside of the home and fulfill their role and their purpose in Elohim's plan. She sees that her trading is profitable, and her lamp does not go out at night. In her hand she holds the distaff and grasps the spindle with her fingers. She opens her arms to the poor and extends her hands to the needy. When it snows, she has no fear for her household, for all of them are clothed in scarlet. She makes coverings for her bed. She is clothed in fine linen and purple. She makes linen garments and sells them, and supplies the merchants with sashes. She is clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come. She's clothed with strength and dignity is not a reference to her adornment, outward adornment, but her inward qualities of beauty, strength and dignity. She speaks with wisdom, and faithful instruction is on her tongue. She watches over the affairs of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children arise and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. Men, are you praising your wife? You should be. That's one of your responsibilities. As well as the washing of the water with the word we read from Ephesians. So, the men have their part in lifting up their wives so that their wives can be loved and appreciated and fulfill their roles in ministry at home and in the assembly. Charm is deceptive, beauty is fleeting. Again, another reference to the outward adornment. But a woman who fears Yahweh is to be praised. Give her the reward she has earned, and let her works bring her praise at the city gate. Hallelujah. The reward, what is the reward she has earned? Well, I would suggest at least a few things, and I'm sure there are a lot more rewards she has earned because of all the things she does for the family and for the assembly. Honor, dignity, praise, thanks, to be well treated and not abused. That abuse thing has got to leave the body of Messiah. We can no longer have any form of abuse in our homes. We need to praise our women and build them up and lift them up, and to be appreciated and loved. Loved. I mean, that was one of the things that Paul said, that women should fear their husbands and that husbands should love their wives. So women, the reward of the woman is to be loved, among all these other things. And so women in supportive roles in the assembly, and this is what I want to emphasize today, not the limitations of women, but the supportive roles and all of the things that women can be involved with in the assembly. Women working side by side toward the goal of bringing the gospel, just as Paul commended several different women of working with him and working side by side in the ministry. Older women teaching younger women, and Paul taught this to Timothy, I believe it was. Timothy or Titus? I think it was Timothy. Women at home with their children, serving their husbands and their children at home. Prophetesses. We see a number of women prophetesses, and this is perfectly legitimate in the assembly, that prophets, when they're given a word from the Father, whether male or female, are it's their duty and responsibility to share that word from the Father with the assembly. That's not the same as teaching or leading or shepherding, but it's a word from the Father that the women can bring to the assembly. Witnesses. Mary, who arrived at the tomb, she was the first one spoken to by the Master, and she was to take that witness to the apostles that he had risen. And so some people take that to mean that Mary was being elevated to a position of apostleship, or of taking a message in the sense of how an apostle would do that, or of even a leadership role where she was going to be telling or explaining to the other apostles and disciples that she had seen the Master. But of course, this isn't what the thrust of that passage is all about. She was given the privilege of taking the message of his resurrection to the apostles who did not yet know that he was raised from the dead. The Samaritan woman was also a witness to the whole town. She learned who the true Messiah was, and she took that message. We're all witnesses, men and women. We all can be witnesses on behalf of the Messiah, and we're called to do that. And that's another role of support for women in the assembly. Servants or deaconesses can help in a variety of different ways, in hospitalities and in feeding the poor, and in all kinds of different roles of helping. Musicians is another helper role that women can be involved with, and of course that's why we have mostly women leading in the musical portion of our service. Praying and prophesying. These are all things that women could do in supportive roles. But what we never see in the Old Testament or in the New is women being heads or leaders, with those sparse or rare exceptions like Deborah, where the situation required that a woman step up into a role that a man was failing to fulfill. And so all of these supportive roles are for our women, and women have a great and important part in the growth of the body, in the ministering of the word. And so my encouragement to the women is not to feel put down, and men should not put women down in the assembly, but that the restriction of being silent is about being in a submissive or supportive role in the assembly, and not to try to take on leadership roles, which Father has clearly established from the beginning to be for men and for men alone. final two slides. At the Miqra. So here is how this plays out at the Miqra and how we hope to follow through with these roles of men and women in this assembly. I'm asking men to step up into your leadership role. And I did so last week with a lot of details, and I'm asking you again, you got to do your part so that women can do their part and not have to be forced into leadership roles, which is what has happened in the church today, in our generation and maybe even earlier. I'm asking women to yield congregational leadership and teaching aspirations to the men to whom Yahweh has assigned them. So the women need to do a bit of yielding here. And that can only happen, again, when the men step up. When the men step up, the women can yield. And I believe the women are willing to yield and to submit to that pattern, allowing the men to do what they're supposed to do. The question and comment portion of our service will remain virtually as it has been. I think what we have is a good thing. This is not an opportunity to bring your own teaching. So stay on point with the teaching for the day when you ask questions and bring your comments. Single women do not have husbands at home to ask questions, as Paul instructed. So they should ask me those questions after the teaching. Because they have no head figure at home, I believe that the best way to go about providing single women with the answers to their questions about the Torah and the rest of scriptures is to allow women, and continue as we have, to allow women to ask questions. Prophets and prophetesses should share the messages from the Holy Spirit with the congregation, with the caveat, and we haven't emphasized this in the past, but we saw it last week in one of the readings, with the caveat that other prophets may judge these prophecies. And so when somebody steps up, man or woman prophet, to speak a prophecy from the Father, I encourage all the others who have the spirit of prophecy in them to listen to the message. Does that message resonate with you? Is the Holy Spirit confirming that message that one individual spoke? And if the Spirit is not confirming it, then the other prophets need to judge the prophecies, whether coming from men or women. Whatever the prophets bring, the other prophets should judge, so that we can be sure that every word spoken by the prophets that comes into our assembly is from the Father. Testimonies are always welcome. Keep them succinct and on point. And please don't bring personal agendas to the floor. These are the only things that I have tried to implement here at the Miqra, and I hope that we can continue along these lines so that everyone is served, and that so everyone can minister in the manner that the Father has given them to minister, so that the word of Elohim will not be maligned, so that people can come in and see that by the order in our assembly, we are doing the Father's will and we're obeying the Father's word and all of these things. So I hope that these teachings aren't an affront or an offense to anyone. They were certainly not meant to be. They were meant only to bring about a biblical perspective and role model for men and women in our assembly, so that we can go about the Father's business in a manner that's pleasing to Him. Hallelujah. And that's the end of my teaching. So, what say you?